Now, what kind of information can you get from a person's claim? Well, first of all, it's very difficult to overstate what a rich wealth of biographical details you can get from a person based on their claim. You can learn where they were born. They'll say, I was born in Union District, South Carolina. You can learn their age, whether they were literate, whether they signed their name with a signature or just put an X. You can learn whether they had any military service. For example, Darius Butler here mentions that he served in the War of 1812. You can learn names of witnesses and kinship relations, like we said, where the person resided in Lauderdale County. I lived 12 miles northeast of Florence on the military road, for example. You'll learn the person's race and their experience of enslavement. Here, Louis Beckwith, the cover page of his claim, merely says that he is colored, and almost every time that a person of color gives testimony or applies, they mention the fact that that person is a person of color. And then also the experience of enslavement. To have interviews with people in Lauderdale County who were held in bondage as slaves is purely remarkable information. Charles Brewer here says that he was enslaved by John Wilson. Now, if you were a descendant of Charles Brewer, having that information of who held your ancestor in bondage would be critical information. Henderson Edwards states that he and his wife were enslaved on 2 different neighboring plantations. So it gives us an idea of what it was like to be married as a slave, that your wife may be held in bondage by a completely different person than you were. These claims will tell us what property was confiscated, when, and by whom. So I had 200 bushels of corn taken by General Hatch in November 1864. They'll tell the dollar amount of property claimed versus the amount that that person received. And in general, it will give an idea of the experience of life for everyday people here in Lauderdale County during the Civil War, which makes them a purely remarkable source of information that is unparalleled. Here, I have to read as well Henry Hart's political sentiments. He says, my sympathies were for the United States government to stand just as she was. I didn't want no Confederacy, God forbid. I was naturally opposed to slavery. The extension of slavery was the cause of secession. I was opposed to secession. So that's from Henry Hart himself, his political views about what caused the war, about slavery, about the whole kit and caboodle. And that's really irreplaceable information that we can get. As with all historical research, there's a certain margin of error here, especially whenever we consider that we're getting information from witnesses, from testimony. There's always the chance that people can get things wrong or that we might misinterpret them. And sometimes they make reference to things that would have been perfectly clear and obvious to them at the time, but now these days, 170 years later, we don't really know what they meant. Like Henry Stutz says that he resides at the crossroads of the Nashville and Lexington roads. Now, where is that? These days, you might have an idea, and I've marked 2 potential points here on the 1907 agriculture map of what he might mean. He says later that the Army encamped on Richardson Creek about half a mile from his home. So that helps me narrow it down. I think what he means is County Road 25 and Alabama Highway 64 on the way to Lexington. I think that's what he means. There's a Henry Stutz cemetery very close by there. But that's not entirely clear. Also, Woodson Armistead here says that he resided 6 miles west of Florence. Well, that seems pretty precise and cut and dry. But where do you start measuring in Florence? Is it at the courthouse? Is it the corner of Court Street and Tennessee Street? Is it the McFarland Landing? Where does he mean? And also, if you go slightly north of west or slightly south of west, you'll get a slightly different result. So we have to understand that there's a slight margin for error here in this testimony. And then also to remember that people are flawed human beings. And naturally, I mean, with testimony being taken in 1873, 74, 75, we're talking about 10 years after the fact that people are being asked to recall these details. Henry Stutz actually says, it has been so long ago that I can't recollect everything, but if I make any mistake, I don't intend to. And I've done my best with my work to cross-reference people's testimony with the available historical record, especially with the official records. So for example, Louis Beckwith here says that he followed federal soldiers to Pulaski. He escaped bondage and went to Pulaski in the spring of 1863 after soldiers of Colonel Phillips' command took his property while they were at Jesse Coger's. Now this is really at odds with the official records. There's no mention of Colonel Phillips in the area in the spring of 1863, and if he had followed federal soldiers in 1863, he probably would have followed them to Corinth. and not to Pulaski. However, if it was the spring of 1864 and not 63, yes, Colonel Phillips most definitely was there, and the headquarters at that time was Pulaski. So it's very likely that he correctly remembered the time of year that it was, but he was off by a year whenever he's recollecting it 10 years later. But now, some claimants have excellent memories. John Burrow, for example, says that wounded soldiers were taken to his house after they had a skirmish on Shoal Creek the 5th of November, 1864. Now that is spot on. I have official records, documents, and dispatches that prove, yes, there was a skirmish on Shoal Creek the 5th of November, 1864, a very significant one. So John Burrow was able to recall to the day the skirmish that brought wounded soldiers to his house. Whenever you plot the 72 claimants on a map, this is what you get. I hope that you notice the clusters. So, of course, people who said they just reside in Florence, I put them in and around Florence. From west to east, there's a cluster here around the Threet, Cloverdale community. There's also a significant cluster on the east side of Shoal Creek, in and around Green Hill, and then trickling over into the Blue Water Creek Valley. And then, of course, there are some outliers in the Waterloo community, the Oakland community, Rogersville, Lexington, but you can really see those clusters there. And this is going to show us where pockets of unionism existed within Lauderdale County, and those friendship, kinship, neighbor relations that I mentioned. Now, whenever you go through all of these claims, you can quantify certain bits of data, which I have done my very best to do with spreadsheets that are very long, and if you want to see them, I'll share them with you. These are the 5 most commonly mentioned federal commanders who took property from claimants in Lauderdale County. Number 1 is General Hatch, the one who took property from my 4th great-grandmother. He's mentioned 21 separate occasions, and he was here on 2 separate occasions in November 1864, and then again after Hood's retreat in December 1864 and early in 65, which are some of the darkest, bleakest days of the war in the Shoals. There's also General Wilson, who had a massive encampment at Gravelly Springs in January 1865, mentioned 15 times. General Croxton, who acted in concert with General Hatch, he's mentioned 14 times. There's Russo, mentioned 12. And then tied for 5th place are Generals Grenville Dodge and William Tecumseh Sherman. And then here are the 5 most common dates that people say their property was taken. November 1864, January 1865, November of 63, Sherman crossed the Tennessee River at Waterloo in November 1863, December 1864, and October 1864. So really there's a chunk here between October of 1864 and January of 1865. Really, the valley has been occupied for 3 full years at this point. There is not a lot left to take. It's been picked clean. And everything available that the Army could subsist on, they took at this time, and the numbers really show that. This is the property that people most commonly mention. I made an enormous spreadsheet for this as well. By far the most common items taken are corn, pork, and hay, or fodder. Lauderdale claimants claimed 13,000 bushels of corn, 64,000 pounds of pork or bacon, 88,725 pounds of fodder, 27,000 fence rails, 600 gallons of molasses, 6,400 pounds of beef, 307 gallons of alcohol. So that'll be like brandy, whiskey, those are the most common ones. There are 86 horses, 62 mules, 77 cattle, 303 swine, 592 individual pieces of poultry, bedding as well, quilts, pillowcases, sheets. One claimant said that what the soldiers did with those is they used them kind of as a haversack, filling grain with their bed sheets and taking them along with them. And then 2,500 pounds of tobacco. By the way, the Southern Claims Commission never paid for tobacco. They only were interested in official Army supplies. So just because the Army did take your tobacco doesn't mean that the government's going to pay for it. Nobody needs tobacco to live. I'm so sorry that they took it, but that's not an official Army supply. And then some other things as well. You see a lot of blacksmith's tools that were taken oftentimes. Shoe leather is something taken. Sometimes people will just say household stuff. So like pots and pans, utensils, things like that. Other people charge for labor, like if the Army had to use your sawmill for a couple of months, or if they made you drive your wagon and haul supplies for them, they'll charge for their labor as well. Now, some of the statistics for property value. By the way, these are all in 1870s dollars, and in the bottom right corner here, I've adjusted those for inflation to give you an idea of what that would be like in 2023. So the grand total claimed by Lauderdale claimants was $67,881.22, which is just over $2 million in 2023 dollars. The amount that was approved, however, is $35,500, just over 52%. The average total that a person claimed was $942, whereas the median is a little bit lower than that at $615. The average total that was approved is $493, 56.98%. The maximum amount that any of the 72 claimants in Lauderdale County claimed was $4,562, which I was pleased to discover was claimed by my fourth great grandmother, Bethany Gray. The commissioners remarked, the claim is much exaggerated. And I always took offense by that, but knowing that she claimed more than anybody else in Lauderdale County, there was a little bit of exaggeration there. But to remember as well, there's no accounting for a person's pain and suffering. That she had been a widow for 4 days whenever the Army took everything that she and her 10 kids had to live on. So ask for the moon. They had what's called a principle of arbitration, which means that their goal is to meet both parties in the middle. So that's why they tend to split the difference. And then the median total claimed, the minimum amount claimed was Benjamin Lettuce at $128. That was a person of color. The maximum amount approved was $2,700 by William Stutz. The maximum percent approved was 100%. Only 3 claimants out of 72 got everything they asked for. That was Henry Butler, Templeton Ellis, and Littleton Williams. Usually those claims were quite reasonable. I think that Henry Butler only asked for $250 for a horse. The government was like, okay, Mr. Butler, you can have your money for your horse. The minimum amount approved was $40 for Samuel Brooks, who was a person of color. The minimum percent approved was 7.27% for Henderson Edwards, also a person of color. So what made a successful claim? Well, a lot of people had vouchers, receipts. Some could prove their military service to the Union. My fourth great-grandfather, William Danley, who served in the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry, submitted his discharge papers in proof of his loyalty. John Burrough submitted receipts that he was given in the 1860s by a commander saying, I took from John Burrough XYZ. Kind of hard to argue with that whenever you've actually got a receipt. He submitted as well his oath of allegiance. Now, most people didn't have documents. They didn't know to ask for them, or if they were given them, they couldn't read. Like in Bethany Gray's claim, one of her sons says, I know she was given a receipt, but I don't know for how much because I can't read. So for those people, having a piece of paper instead of money in their hand was essentially worthless. And 10 years later, they didn't have those documents to prove. So most people had to rely on the testimony of their neighbors, their witnesses, to prove that they were loyal and had property taken officially. Also, there's a certain factor of race here because people of color undoubtedly met with greater skepticism than people who were not enslaved. The average amount approved for white claimants was 59.45%, but for people of color it was only 43.5%. So, not a huge gap, but it is demonstrable by the numbers that people of color had the deck stacked against them a little bit more. Whenever you read through all the claims, you start to see the same phrases popping up again and again, and I've chosen some of those just off the top of my head that came to me. One is they were bound to have it. So the soldiers took my property. I protested, but they said they were bound to have it. And I underlined instances, bound to have it, bound to have it. In John W. Smith's case, he said, the soldier said, old man, we hate to treat you so, but we are bound to have something to eat. So it wasn't really personal. They had to take what they could find. And then, as I said, if we don't get it, the rebels will. Here, Jacob Stutz, they said they were bound to have it to subsist on. I spoke about myself being a Union man, to which they remarked that if they did not get it, the rebels would, and that I would get pay for it. And then also, I knew them by their marks. In order to prove that your property was officially lawfully taken, they would have to say, it was an officer that ordered the taking. And I knew that they were officers by their marks. And that pops up again and again, that the people recognized people of higher rank because of the way that their uniforms look different. Some common themes that the petitions all show are the threats of violence that Union people had to routinely deal with in their communities. And then, as I said, the experience of enslavement, and then also the experience of emancipation for people of color. They tell what a person's political sentiments were. They show us the socio-political roles for women in the community at the time. They show us how difficult it was to navigate the guerrilla warfare, the partisan fighting and the vigilantism here in Northwest Alabama, and then also what it was like to avoid and escape from rebel conscription. We'll go through some of these a little more in detail. Threats of violence. I'm going to go through and read some of these. They're very telling. Darius Butler says, I said, if they killed me, they would not rob me of many days. They called him, pardon my French, a damned old Tory. And his response to them was that if they killed him, they would not rob him of many days. He was already an old man at that point. The use of the word Tory, which is a holdover from the American Revolution, meaning a person who was loyal to Great Britain. That was a term that got used for Unionists in Alabama, people who resisted secession, calling them a Tory. William Lyles says, I was threatened to be hung by a rebel Captain Ham for my Union sentiments. And then William Gottney here mentions by name the men he says injured him and his family. He says there's John Wilson, Bud Richardson, a man named Bernie, Clemens, Hammonds, James Whitehead. So the thing to take away from that is the fact that these are not just anonymous encounters, that the men who were on the receiving end of this violence and threats, they knew the people personally. They bore reputations of unionism in their communities, and they were familiar with the names of their neighbors who were preying upon them. John W. Michael says, Thomas and Alex Mackey threatened to burn me out if I did not go into the rebel army. William Ross says he was also called a damned old Tory. Jesse Thomas says that John Perryman's son was killed by a party of rebels on account of his Union sentiments. So the testimony routinely show the kinds of intimate, interpersonal conflicts and hardships that people faced on account of their reputations for unionism in their communities. By extension, the claims will also give witness to a person's political sentiments. Here, William Seago describes what he did in the election of 1860 and the secession crisis. He, like others, point out that the Ordinance of Secession was never put to a popular vote in Alabama, but was ratified by the convention, which many Unionists were still bitter about even in the 1870s. And then, of course, the election of 1860, there were really two candidates that people from Lauderdale who were Unionists voted for routinely, and that's John Bell, the compromise candidate, the constitutional Unionist, and Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat. Jared Gresham apparently said to Jesse Thomas that leading secession politicians was the cause of the war. People, Unionists would often blame politicians who were just trying to better their own careers for stirring up dissent. And one of those, the ringleader of them, was William Lowndes Yancey, who you'll see over here on the right. Guilford King, my fifth great-grandfather, says, I was for the Union first and last. I was for the preservation of the country which my forefathers established. I regarded secession as ruinous. I was not able to get to the polls to vote. I am a cripple, but I would have voted for the Union. We'll also see the difficult situation that people faced with the guerrilla warfare and conscription in the area. People often say that they would lie out in the woods. That was the common phrase. I would spend the day lying out in the woods watching for the conscription gang to come around. And some of them did a little farming while they also were lying out in the woods, but they had to be very careful who came around their neighborhood. John Till here, who was actually a Confederate who testified for James Haynes' claim, he says, there was a lot of loose squads of men about that country that used to hail from Roddy, Forrest, or Wheeler's command. They were often robbers and horse thieves. If they saw a man with a good horse, they took it. It mattered not what side he belonged to. So this is some evidence we can see of how people used the chaos of the situation to profit from it, to better themselves, and that they simply took what they could find regardless of a person's political sentiments. The person he mentions here, by the way, is Colonel Philip Roddy, who's a native of Moulton, and oftentimes people like my fourth great-grandfather, John Wilson Michael, say that they were arrested and conscripted by Roddy. He seems to be particularly active in rounding up Union men in this area. And then, again, people mentioning by name Bill Monroe and Bert Hayes as some of the Confederate partisans particularly active in their neighborhood. I can't really overstate how unique the experience of enslavement is, being encapsulated in these Southern Claims documents. People who were illiterate left us no other written records about what they went through as a person who was enslaved in Lauderdale County. And we know such revealing things about their lives because of their testimony. For example, the fact that you may have to pay someone to profit from your own labor. I was a slave and belonged to the widow Nancy Poole. I hired my time He says that he hired his time from Nancy Poole, that he was held by another man who stood in as master for him, and he paid $50 to him per annum as well to stand in as master for him. A lot of people, I'm trying to think if it's Henry Dunn, I think it's Henry Dunn, was a blacksmith at Baugh Kennedy and Company, and he was enslaved by John Wilson, but his labor was hired out to Baugh Kennedy and Company. He was allowed to work after hours and work for himself, but his labor was rented out as a token of the fact that he was held in bondage. These claims will show who held the person in bondage. Henderson Edwards explains that he was a slave of James Stewart, and his wife belonged to Judge Posey, but he was actually hired out to Judge Posey so that he could live on the same plantation with his wife, even though he was held in bondage by a different man. And I can't even scratch the surface with how remarkable these claims are, and especially the experience of people, I think it's Louis Beckwith, who followed federal soldiers to Pulaski. Federal soldiers, according to his claim, robbed him. They took his clothes, they took his pocket watch, they took the money out of his pocket. He was serving at that time as a driver, as a teamster for the Federal Army in Pulaski, and he was robbed by federal soldiers. Unfortunately, the SCC never paid for incidents of depredation, so he didn't receive any money for his pocket watch or his clothes. Sociopolitical roles for women. For example, my fourth great grandmother says that I done all a woman could to advance the cause of the Union. Now, obviously, women in the 1860s had very limited roles in politics in the public sphere, but women like Ann Turner urged the men in her life, like Henry Hart, to vote for the Union and advised young men to keep out of the Confederate Army. So whereas women lacked an official voice in the political process, they could still exercise their social influence over the men in their families and neighborhoods to try and get them to fall in line with a Union ideology. And then two people here, John Burroughs' wife and Barbara Crastell, said that they cared for Union soldiers in their own homes who were wounded. And Miss Burrough here, actually, it's a remarkable case where John Burrough took in these three men. They were wounded in the battle at Shoal Creek and initially taken to a man named Richardson's house, but Richardson was a rebel. And the neighborhood all agreed that if the men were going to be kept and nursed, they should be done so by a Union man rather than a rebel. And so they hauled them in a wagon to Lexington to John Burroughs' house, and his wife cared for them in her own home. And I should have printed off so I could read a little bit better. The man who's interviewed here, Mr. McCarty, as fate would have it, was a watchman in the Treasury Department in the 1870s. And so whenever the SCC was investigating this claim, they brought him before him because he was already in Washington, D.C., and he was asked to give testimony about how he was treated at Mr. Burroughs' house. And he remembers that Miss Burrough and the family were very religious and would sing hymns to him while they were nursing him. And he says comically that I was rather the reverse myself. So he wasn't necessarily a religious person, but the religiosity of Miss Burrough and her family made an impression on him all those years later whenever he was recalling how well cared for. He says that I was taken care for as well as if I was in my own father's house. So women, in other words, even though they lacked the same kind of political power that men had in the community, they nevertheless exercised great power in their own lives and also contributed to the war effort in Lauderdale County in forms of caring for wounded soldiers literally in their own homes. A couple of remarkable cases here I'd like to talk about. Caroline Robinson, whom I mentioned, she was a free woman of color who was also a single mother. She was a seamstress who had property in her own right. She lived in Tuscumbia at the beginning of the war, but then she moved across the river in 1863. Her father-in-law was a free person of color named Woodson Armistead, who's also a claimant to the SCC. Her son, Willie, says that whenever war broke out, he was going to school in Canada. And I'm not sure, but I think that this may be the famous Buxton Academy, which educated young men of color, mostly from the South, who fled to Canada to receive an education. So her son, Willie, is better educated than a lot of the people in Lauderdale County in that he actually went to a school, to an academy. In the 1870s, he's a school teacher. And this is the inside of the Buxton Academy, what it looks like today as a museum. And then Samuel Stafford, please excuse me a moment. Samuel Stafford owned a dry goods store in downtown Florence. And whenever General Buell crossed over the Tennessee River in July in the summer of 1862, Samuel Stafford had taken from his store, and this is a ledger book from his store, some of the things that were taken were barrels of whiskey, barrels of brandy, French cordial. This was all taken for medical use, of course, medical use for the army. And Mr. Stafford, of course, tried to go to headquarters to get a voucher for the property that was taken. And he was told that the person, the quartermaster who could give him a receipt, was still on the other side of the Tennessee River to come back later that evening. So he came back and he waited and he waited and he waited, and it became nightfall. And they said, well, you know, you better come back tomorrow. He still hasn't crossed the river. So Mr. Stafford went home. And in the meantime, the army started rolling out of town. And Mr. Stafford the next morning is standing on the corner in front of his store, and he sees wagons rolling by, and he recognizes the barrels of brandy and whiskey rolling by from his store. And you see advertisements here in the 1870s where his successors, Reed and Stafford, are opening up a store. And they still are advertising amongst their goods that they offer champagne, port, Madeira, and good apple brandy. So Mr. Stafford's legacy lived on there. They were able to rebuild. And then the promised scandalous situations, because everyone knows that's what's most interesting. The case of James Calvin Myrick is one of the most convoluted and hotly contested in Lauderdale County, mostly because of the conflicting reports from his neighbors about his loyalty during the war. First of all, a man named Welcome McGee testified, I never heard that he pretended to be loyal until he filed a claim. So William McGee is saying he was a rebel all throughout the war. He talked for the secession and all that. He was a rebel man. I didn't even know he claimed to be a Unionist till I heard he filed a claim. But then Thomas LaFan was interviewed and says, excuse me, I know Welcome McGee. I do know his reputation. It is bad. He is known as a liar. He tells stories for humor. So here Thomas LaFan, who by the way was a Union veteran, says, oh, Welcome McGee, you can't trust him as far as you can throw him. He tells stories for fun. So, you know, discrediting his testimony, in other words. Now, James Calvin Myrick also recounted a very interesting encounter he had with this man, Elias Thrasher, who is second lieutenant of Company B of the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry. He says that he found out he was reported to the special agent, that he was going to be investigated, and he ran into Elias Thrasher in town. Mr. Thrasher told him he had been reported. Here to quote Mr. Myrick, he was drinking a little. I will satisfy you for your trouble, he said. There was no amount stated. So here Elias Thrasher apparently was having a few, and Mr. Myrick says, if you go and testify for Richmond that I was loyal, I'll make it worth your while whenever the check from the government clears. So here Elias Thrasher apparently was a man who for the right price might be bought. And that is not the only time, by the way, that testimony shows that Elias Thrasher might be swayed if you put a little cash in his hand to testify in your favor. This is a letter from the attorney Thomas Fullerton, who handled many of the cases. It's from one of the barred and disallowed claimants, which was George Pruitt. And I printed this off to be able to read it better, and I forgot that. So I want to read this in full because it's very telling. He says, I doubt very much the propriety of taking the unsupported statements of Mr. Elias Thrasher in any case on any subject. I had a personal interview with him on the 12th of July last at Florence, Alabama, and I am now satisfied that on account of his violent prejudices, he is an unsafe man, either for or against a claim. His prejudice against the poor colored people is most violent and unreasonable. So here the attorney Thomas Fullerton says, don't trust Elias Thrasher alone on his word. Now the irony is, as we'll see in a moment, the fact of him being a lieutenant in a Union regiment meant that the folks in Washington took his word to be good as gold. And if Elias Thrasher said you were loyal, you were loyal. If he said, on the other hand, that you were a dirty rebel, case closed. I'm sorry, rejected. Elias Thrasher says you were disloyal. And we know he can be trusted because he was a lieutenant in a Union regiment. As I mentioned as well, for people of color, it was a lot more difficult to prove their claims for a variety of reasons. Benjamin Lettuce here gets rather defensive with Avery, who's interviewing him. He says, I wouldn't lie for money. You are writing for a man that hasn't got much sense, but I'm used to money. He thinks that Mr. Avery doesn't think that he has a very good grasp of how much his property was worth. But he goes on to say that, wasn't I there whenever they weighed out the coffee in front of me? I paid for it in gold. So he gets very defensive about the fact that, yes, he had a very good idea about what his property was worth. He paid for it. Then Avery says about him, "I forward the statements of claimant to show his inability to tell the truth. Several of the colored people in this place filed claims and all swear for each other." So he thinks they're all in cahoots together. They can't get their story straight, they all swear for each other. But of course, their witnesses are few and far between. And it must also be stated that Union men in the county all swear for each other as well and aren't necessarily held to that same irrelevant, arbitrary standard. Now, so what about the barred and disallowed claimants? My research focuses in on the claimants who were approved, simply because those documents are more available, there are more of them, and barred and disallowed claimants, it's hit or miss what you'll be able to find. Sometimes you just find a card saying that the person applied and there's nothing else in their file. But we can still get some information from them about what might make a claim unsuccessful. As I mentioned, if Elias Thrasher was against you, that's pretty much the end of your case. In Elizabeth Baker's case here, it says, "Reported disloyal by Elias Thrasher, Florence, Alabama." That's all there was to it. Her claim was rejected. The government was looking for any and all reasons it could have to reject your claim, and if Elias Thrasher didn't like you, then that was good enough for anyone. Here, if you couldn't prove your loyalty, then your claim would be rejected. For example, in the case of Adrian Sharp, they didn't think that he was very loyal because the Union Army burned his home and he didn't get any pay for it, so he obviously was a dirty rebel. Why would they do that otherwise? And then Henry Patton here, who merely couldn't prove to the government's satisfaction that his property was lawfully taken. And then the significance to genealogy research, which is how I got started on this in the first place and why we're all arguably here, the amount of detail that you can get about your ancestors' lives if they were a claimant to the SCC is unparalleled in terms of 19th century documents. Unless you're one of the very lucky few who your ancestor kept a diary, which means that they were of a certain social status, that they were literate enough to keep a diary and had enough free time to sit around keeping a diary rather than having to eke out a living for your family. These documents will give you first-person actual quotations of what your ancestor apparently said to the commissioners. For example, all of these key biographical facts about their life. Here in this one blurb from Stephen Coleman's claim, his witness is Joseph Green. This says, quote, "Joseph Green, colored, a stepson of claimant, about 19 years of age, a farmer by occupation, now living in Alcorn County, Mississippi." Now, if you're a genealogist, you know what a smoking gun having that information in writing could be. To say that the claimant with a different name was a stepson of Stephen Coleman and moved to Alcorn County, Mississippi, that's gold. And then also important dates about the person's life. Like here, Bethany Gray states that she's a widow. She was married 34 years ago. She says the day that her husband died. And then she lists all of her children by name and what their ages are. And that's remarkable information to have straight from, if you'll pardon the expression, the horse's mouth. And then John Wilson Michael says that he's Guilford King's son-in-law, which if you didn't have a document proving that John married Sarah King, how would you otherwise know that? So this is just to scratch the surface, by the way. I couldn't possibly give you an accurate understanding of how the richness of biological, biographical, genealogical details that you get from these claims. They're really a treasure trove, and it's been such a pleasure going through all of them. I mean, in conclusion, to say that I do this very much as a labor of love, and I'm so grateful to my ancestors for enduring what they did, for going through not only the experience of Civil War and navigating that, but having the tenacity to go through 7 or 8 years worth of claims process. Bethany Gray, I made complaint to General Hatch about taking all I had to live on. Now, these kinds of personal struggles. The fact that I can stand in front of you today, well-educated, well-dressed, with a wonderful job in my community, is thanks to them and the sacrifices that they made that I can be here living this life of luxury in the 21st century. John Michael stealing a canoe, escaping Confederate conscription, rowing across the Tennessee River on Christmas Eve, and then taking his family north to Pulaski to escape persecution. William Danley, these are all my 4th great-grandparents, by the way. William Danley serving as first lieutenant of Company B in the Tennessee Mounted Infantry, taking sides, being people of principle, and especially whenever it was something that could cost you your life, your livelihood, your reputation for sticking with the old Union, the Stars and Stripes, the flag that flies above us to this day. And I cannot tell you how proud I am of all of them and what a privilege it is to be able to tell you a little bit about their experiences and their stories. And if you want to learn more, you can always visit us here at the library. As I said, the library maintains a subscription to Fold 3 by Ancestry so that you can go in for yourself and read these 19th century documents that are preserved through the Southern Claims Commission for all the counties of Alabama, for all the counties of the SCC. They're just a rich source of information, and they're fascinating to me. Thank you all for being here. I'm about to lose my voice, so I'm going to have to cut it off. But if anyone has any questions, I'd love to be able to answer those if I can.